Welcome everyone to today's webinar entitled Managing a Crisis, hosted by the Georgia Fruit and Vegetable Growers Association and presented by Amy Philpott of Watson Green and one of the three members of the Recall Ready team. This is the first webinar in our Crisis Communications webinar series. Feel free to access all 5 webinars found on the Georgia Fruit and Vegetable Growers Association Crisis Management webpage at www.gfvga.org. I am Beth Olson, Director of Education and Food Safety for the Georgia Fruit and Vegetable Growers Association, and will be moderating today's webinar. Before we get started, let's go over a few housekeeping items. Please note, this is a pre-recorded webinar, but even being a pre-recorded webinar, technology has made it possible for you to submit questions at any time during this webinar. Simply type your questions into the questions text box. At the end of this webinar, all submitted questions will be sent to us and we will send answers via email. There will be an FAQ housed on the GFVGA Crisis Management webpage of all submitted questions and answers. If you experience any issues with the audio coming through your computer speakers, please make sure your computer speakers are on and the volume is turned up. You may also use the telephone dial-in option. Lastly, I would like to draw your attention to the handouts box on the webinar control box. The handouts box contains links to today's presentation and other useful tools, such as Is Your Company Prepared for a Recall Checklist, produced by the United Fresh Recall Ready program. Now, with the housekeeping items behind us, let's get to the webinar. Today's webinar, Managing a Crisis, will set the foundational principles and elements to manage any crisis. Again, this is the first of 5 webinars in a series designed to help prepare for a crisis before it happens. Industry experts would agree the best time to prepare for a crisis is not once it happens. And for the large majority of instances, most crises are not expected. The Georgia Fruit and Vegetable Growers Association has a crisis communication and management plan available for members to use as an outline. And that outline can be used to create a specific crisis communication and management plan for any farm or produce operation. It's designed to conform and help address most any crisis, such as foodborne illness, labor shortage, weather, or the unfortunate accidental employee death. The 5 webinars in this crisis communication series are designed to provide high-level information and overview in a short amount of time. After the webinar, if more in-depth technical information is needed, you're welcome to contact me, Beth Olson, with the Georgia Fruit and Vegetable Growers Association, any of the 3 presenters from the Recall Ready program, or attend a Recall Ready workshop offered through the United Fresh Produce Association. Speaking of the Recall Ready team, today our presenter is one of the Recall Ready team trio, Amy Philpott, Vice President of Issue Management and Crisis Management with Watson Green in Washington, D.C. Amy specializes in crisis communication and reputation management for food and agriculture companies. She works with companies to prepare for product recalls and is a resource for companies during recalls and other crises. She has helped companies and associations in the fresh produce, nut, imported specialty food, and processed meat industries use strategic communications to protect their brands, reputations, and business relationships during crises. Before joining Watson Green, she managed communications for the United Fresh Produce Association, handling the association's communications during several high-profile foodborne illness outbreaks. Amy grew up in California's San Joaquin Valley, where she helped cultivate and market grapes and oranges grown on her family's farm. It is with this wealth of expertise and renown that I now turn the program over to Amy Philpott.
Thank you, Beth, and thank you for inviting me to speak today. You know, managing a crisis begins with understanding our goals, and it doesn't matter what the crisis is, the goals are the same. We want to protect people, our products, and our property. And by property, I mean not just, of course, the facilities that we operate in, but things like brands and reputation. So with that in mind, we can then begin to understand the benefits of having a plan. How do we achieve those goals? If we're going to protect people first and foremost, our product, that's the quality and value of our products, and our property, including those intangible assets like brands and reputation, we need a crisis management plan. And of course, Georgia Fruit and Vegetable Growers Association has templates available. Hopefully the information that we have here is going to complement what your members and others have available to them. So let's talk about what a plan does and what it is. First and foremost, it's a decision-making tool, and it's going to help companies that face either crises or potential crises determine not only what to do, but who within the company or who, in terms of an external resource, should actually be doing that activity, how they'll do it, where if appropriate, and when relative to other activities. Most importantly, it helps companies avoid analysis paralysis. And this is something that happens when companies get tied up in waiting for more information and waiting and waiting and waiting. They never get all the information that they need, but they can't make a decision either. So what a plan does is set forth a response process. And in this response process, a company will recognize when something happens or when it might happen, right? So we don't have to have a building blowing up in order to recognize that there's a crisis. There might be something more subtle that happens, but it's important that companies be able to identify in their plan what constitutes early detection and how employees should respond if they believe something might turn into a crisis. What is the initial information that is gathered, and so forth. We're going to go through each one of these steps. The other thing that a crisis management plan should include are tools and templates. The first, and probably one of the most important, is a list of team members and alternates. Roles and responsibilities, the external resource list, a command center list, a list of audiences that the company will need to communicate with for the particular issue that they're dealing with, and a communication plan and templates. And we'll go through each one of these briefly now. So when a company is identifying who should be on their crisis response team, there are a couple of things that they should realize. Number one is, especially with produce companies, there are usually two different teams. A core team that may be only 2 or 3 people. So typically it's maybe a CEO or a general manager. It may be the food safety person and maybe an executive VP of operations, for example. And when that trigger event comes in, that information that tells the company or someone in the company that, oh, something might be wrong here, we should report it to someone. That's the team that gets the initial report. And there's usually only a couple of people on that core team. Then there's a larger response team. So if the core team looks at all of the information and says, we better activate the core team because this could definitely be something that we have to respond to. Then there's a larger response team that may have 5, 6, 7, even 8 people on it, depending on the issue. What's important is, number one, that you have alternates, right? And especially if the company has to meet the requirements of, say, SQF or some of the other auditing schemes, they do want to see alternates listed, and you should definitely have alternates. It's going to happen at a time when somebody critical is on vacation. So have alternates for everybody on both the core team as well as the response team. The other thing that you want to make sure is that when you're eventually assigning roles and responsibilities, that everyone on your team has a role and a responsibility. I look at plans all the time that have 8 people on a crisis response team, but only 2 people are assigned roles and responsibilities. That tells me one of 2 things. Either you have way too many people listed on your team, or you have way too many activities assigned to too few people. So if you're going to list someone on your response team, they should have roles and responsibilities that are clearly defined. Now, keep in mind, there may be someone that has the role of keeping the normal business going while the rest of the team deals with the crisis. Nevertheless, that should be very clear. So what are some of the roles and responsibilities? And to a great degree, this will drive who you have on your crisis response team. The first thing is a leader, somebody who will ultimately make the decisions. So if the team is conflicted on how to act or what their recommendation is, ultimately somebody has to be in charge. And the leader will oversee all of these other responsibilities. In other words, the leader is the conductor of the orchestra. He or she makes sure that everything is working in coordination with one another and that all of the different activities are being carried out. So who else might be on the team based on these roles and responsibilities? Someone who interacts with the regulatory officials. In most cases, this is a produce company, or excuse me, a food safety person at a produce company, because most of the time food companies are dealing with recalls, but not always. If this is a labor issue, it may be the HR person that is interacting with regulatory. You want someone assigned to oversee the communications with the general public and consumers, someone who oversees the interaction with employees. Regardless of what the crisis is, your employees will be involved. And if the crisis doesn't directly affect them, the company will want to communicate with them. Someone who is a liaison with your legal counsel. If you have legal counsel in-house, then you probably don't need a separate liaison on the team. You would simply have your lawyer on the team. But otherwise, you would want a liaison with legal counsel. Any crisis is going to involve a financial implication and insurance implications. So you want someone to oversee those responsibilities. It's hard to imagine a crisis that doesn't affect operations, and that your suppliers, your vendors, your transportation vendors, and input suppliers as well. So you want someone in charge of overseeing everything that goes into the operations or how the operations are being affected. And then finally, typically sales oversees the customer relations, but you also have to make sure you have somebody who understands the agreements that your company has with customers. You may have obligations depending on what the issue is. You may have obligations based on your supplier agreements, You have to be careful that you're complying with all of those. Finally, there's communications, and that wraps around everything. Ideally, all of the people in these different roles and responsibilities would be singing from the same hymn book, if you will. In other words, they would be using approved messages. They would all be saying essentially the same thing, but for their particular group that they are communicating with. So communications goes all the way around that. This is one reason why in a food safety issue such as a recall, you don't want your food safety quality assurance person to also be the leader, because that person is going to be busy communicating with regulators and conducting the actual recall. The leader has to oversee all of these roles, and your food safety person just simply isn't going to have enough time. You should also have a list of external resources, such as legal counsel that focuses on specific aspects of the law, like food law. You might add one here for labor laws or labor issues. Immigration issues might be another type of legal counsel that you might list here. And a command center checklist is also helpful. Remember to assign this to someone so that as the leader of the group, you aren't trying to make sure you have enough chairs in the room, or that you've chosen a place that has internet connection, or if you have enough electrical outlets for everybody to charge their phones. You want to think about this ahead of time. Some of these are you might think are kind of outdated and funny, like a VCR, DVR, or a fax machine. You never know, depending on the crisis, you may not have access to internet. Fax machine may be the only way you can communicate to folks like customers or even the media, depending on what the crisis is. Same with a crisis survival kit. Assign this to someone and make sure that they can put this together either quickly or have it put together in advance. Again, if a hurricane, for example, hits your office, you won't have access to a lot of this, at least not easy access. So having this set aside can be helpful and just allows you to save time when you need to be responding to whatever the crisis is. Finally, under tools and templates, I recommend making a list of audiences that you may need to communicate with in a crisis. Now, you won't need to communicate with all of these in every crisis, but if you make a list and you note the responsibility, right, the person who's responsible for communicating with these audiences, then during a crisis, you can just go through each one of these and say, oh, we don't have a board of directors, we don't need that. You may have owners, though, so that may be an audience. This particular crisis doesn't require we communicate with elected officials, so we won't do that one, but we do need somebody for customers and buyers, employees, media, etc. It just saves time. Now, the other tools and templates that you would have in a plan actually are more crisis specific. So you might have a communication plan that then has crisis specific templates. And we're going to address those in webinar 5. Right now, let's go to the crisis response process. Now, you can make this 10 steps or you can make it 3 steps. I've broken it down into 7 because it seems to be manageable and kind of follows the natural flow of a crisis. But you can certainly condense these into fewer steps or drag them out into others. We will apply this crisis response process to a food safety issue in webinar number 2. So let's go through these top line so that you understand what each step entails. First of all, You have to get on whatever is happening very quickly. This first step, identifying a trigger, gathering the initial information, will determine whether you drive the bus you're on or you become a passenger. You want to drive it. You want to be in as much control as possible, and this is how you do that. Early detection. Your plan should identify what employees do when they get the initial sense, if you will, that something is wrong. Now, again, it may be obvious, but it's not always obvious. They should know that they need to collect the basic facts and then report those to whomever your plan says they need to be reported to. Okay? Then that core team, as I said, will evaluate this initial information. Do they need to activate the larger crisis team? Do we need to have a comment prepared this early on? You may have to. If the news is already out, or if the crisis is such that the news is already on site, then you may need a comment prepared immediately. Or you may want to prepare one just in case you get a call. So let's say that core team evaluates that initial information and says, yes, we need to assemble the team. We don't know if we're going to go into full-on crisis mode yet, but we feel like we need the team's input, and we should notify the team in case they get questions elsewhere. So you've identified the core team. You should have identified the response team as well. You should have alternates so that if there is someone missing, you can bring in the alternate right away. They need to be trained on how to be part of the team as well. Determine where the team meets. If there's somebody out of the office or traveling a lot, how will they get into a secure conference line? How will you get that secure conference line information to people? Who's going to actually run the meeting? And what are you going to discuss during that first meeting? Do you want to review the roles and responsibilities at this point? Have you even assigned them? Hopefully, if you have a plan, you have. And then at this point, the leader of the team needs to decide if all of the team members are going to remain active or not. And if not, what does that mean? If they aren't going to remain active, then at what point might they be brought back into the process? And what do they say to anyone who may ask them about this issue in the meantime? So they're going to need some talking points as well. Most likely in that first team meeting where you have your crisis response team meeting, there will be more questions than answers. The initial information that was gathered won't be enough to answer everyone's questions. So you need to figure out what else do you need to know in order to decide the next step. And do you need to bring in some of those external resources? And do we need to start preparing for possible communication? You come back to the table after you've gathered all of that additional information, and it needs to be assessed. So what does this mean? Do we have time to collect more information, or do we need to make a decision now? What are the various regulatory, operational, legal, and reputational implications? And all of these implications are referred to in webinars 3, 4, and 5 of this series. I find at this point it's often difficult to make decisions, and if companies go back to their mission statement, they go back to why they exist and what they believe in, oftentimes that helps them make a decision. There are also other guidelines that can be used. If any of these are true, then the situation should definitely be considered serious and action should be taken as soon as possible. Is there loss of life, serious injury? Does the situation affect the company's ability to meet demand? Have any laws or regulations been breached? Has the media inquired about this, or do they know about it yet? And does the situation risk lives or risk consumers? After that assessment, oftentimes companies have to make decisions without perfect or complete information, and that's just the way crises work. So you have to decide, what are we going to do, what are we going to say, and to whom are we going to say it? Much of the templates that we discussed earlier really focus on helping with those decisions in terms of your audiences and the responsibilities of who will communicate with each of those responsibilities. So now you respond and you act. You actually do it, you say it, and you keep track of what's going on. Notice that while some plans focus on this particular step, actually issuing statements or actually doing things, it's a very small part of what a company actually goes through to become crisis ready. Oftentimes you get put into a cycle that goes back from responding and acting in step 6 back up to step 3 or sometimes 4, where you're getting more information, you're assessing it, maybe you're deciding whether to change your action or change what you're saying. At some point, and I generally recommend that when a company is out of the news, at some point you hold a debriefing meeting and you thank those who helped, you update your plan, and most importantly, do not get stuck in thought that now that we've been through a crisis, we don't need to practice because we've been through it. Each crisis is different and you have to stay crisis ready. So practice. I recommend companies practice their plan every 12 to 18 months. And don't just give the plan to people or tell them about it, but involve them. Help them understand what their role is. This is generally best done as a simulation versus what the produce industry calls mock recalls, which are generally traceability exercises, for example, if you're dealing with a food safety issue. But you may want to run a simulation that deals with another type of issue as well and involves everyone on your team. So in summary, when you're planning, be proactive. Think the unthinkable. The written plan is extremely important in being able to respond quickly and effectively. You have to have your team and their alternates selected ahead of time, or you will be scrambling when things are seemingly out of control. Develop your response framework, the process that we just talked about, and checklists, and then conduct that training and those test exercises. Beth, that concludes my presentation for today. I'll hand it back over to you.
Thank you, Amy. This was absolutely spot on. I can't tell you how many times we get phone calls here. Of course, from my standpoint, it's typically a food safety issue, but people are stuck in that, here's the situation, and we feel like we should do this, or we're getting pressure from either a regulatory body or a consumer, a buyer, to issue a recall. And so they may have a food safety or a food recall and traceability plan, but it's all typically tied back to an audit requirement. So going through all of these steps that you've outlined today has just been perfect, because being in that early time frame where you take a few minutes to breathe before the hurricane hits, the quote unquote more metaphorical crisis hurricane hits, and so you're taking a minute to breathe, and you're able to think about, okay, what has come to us, what is the problem, and how do we expect to address it? How are we going to move forward with this? And you're gathering in the information and making sure that you actually need to pull a trigger, or is this something that you can manage in other ways? So I think that you have hit this spot on. Thank you. So I know that you deal with lots of very high profile recalls. And so in thinking about those types of recalls that you're involved in versus maybe some of the recalls or crises that may be a little more closely related to others that are on this webinar in the southeastern United States, I can expect that the crises that you've been involved in have been fairly large and very wide reaching and probably very expensive. So if we bring this back down to maybe a smaller scale, and maybe companies don't have all the resources to do everything that you mentioned in the Recall Ready checklist, what do you feel like the single most important thing, or maybe even a handful of things, would be for a company that doesn't have the resources that, say, a name brand, consumer brand may have?
Yeah, I think that's a common issue for a lot of companies, Beth. I mean, not all companies are going to be big and have the resources. And actually, some of what I would consider the most successful crisis management projects I've worked on never made the news to a big degree. So sometimes staying out of the news is as much a goal as being able to manage the news cycle you've been thrown into. I would say for companies that are maybe under-resourced or feel that they don't have some of the resources that it might take, first of all, you have to realize that whether you have them internally in your own company or not, you're going to need them, because there isn't any of the activities that we talked about that gets tossed aside because you are a smaller company or a less resourced company. You still have the same amount of activities that any size company has to do. So you have to find a way. You have to find a way to deal with them. There are a couple of things that I recommend to clients. Number one is check with your insurance company. Even your general liability policy may have some provisions for crisis preparedness work, right? You don't have to have a recall policy to get some of these benefits. So check with your insurance company. Depending on your policy, they may have resources available to you, either to prepare for a crisis, such as help with writing a plan, or a list of resources that are available to you through your insurance company if you find yourself in a crisis. So use that as a resource. The other advice or recommendation that I make to companies is to be very creative in advance in terms of how you assign responsibilities. So somebody who perhaps doesn't have a responsibility right now in any of those areas, and ask yourself, in a crisis, is there somebody we can pull out of their normal daily job and have them do this particular issue or this particular activity? I worked with a very, very small farmer in the Southeast at one point, and it was just two brothers and their wives, and they both had teenage daughters, and we got the whole family involved. The teenage daughters were pulling messages off of the phone message machine and giving them to their parents to respond to. So sometimes you have to think outside the box.
Excellent, excellent. Which goes back to the majority of what we're working with here in the produce industry is still a family farm, and sometimes it's all hands on deck.
Yep.
I would add to that. We, as the Georgia Fruit and Vegetable Growers Association, have definitely found that we have members that reach out to us during different crises. I know in the past 2 years we have been an integral part of a crisis team with at least 2 farms that had accidental employee deaths. I would say every year I get at least 4 different foodborne illness recall calls, panicked calls, but calls where I'm helping walk them through collecting the information, all how they respond to FDA, how they're responding to their customers, and oftentimes I am sending them to you, but nonetheless, you have your trade associations, and many of your trade associations on a state or local level, or even on the national level, also have resources that can help you out. So don't underestimate that.
Yeah, that's a good point, Beth. Absolutely. The associations are great resources before, during, and after.
Yes, yes. So I think one last thing that kind of came to mind as you were going through all this presentation is, as you think about these different crises and the companies that are going through them, whether it be a foodborne illness and them having to recall, or it be a labor crisis or shortage, or something that never makes the news, is there anything that you have found that you would say would be the most challenging for these companies?
It really depends, Beth, on whether they've prepared or not, right? So for a company that has a plan and has gone through the process of identifying a team and roles and responsibilities, I would say the pace of how quickly things move is the greatest challenge. So they know what to do, and the people in charge of doing the activities know their responsibility, but things happen so quickly that it's just hard to keep up. If it's a company that, for whatever reason, has not done the pre-work and doesn't have a plan, just staying above water is a struggle, and that's in every aspect of the crisis management response.
Yeah.
The speed alone, is challenging, but then on top of it, if you haven't thought about who's going to do what and who you can call for help and have those numbers right there, it just becomes survival mode.
Excellent. Excellent. And some of those little nuances, like having that list already available, even if you've got teenagers that can drive, knowing that they can go down to the grocery store and buy snacks that will last you and your team for 2 or 3 days as you're held up in some sort of conference room, handling all of this. It may seem small as you're looking at it, and as you may be working with a food safety consultant like me, or if it's a different crisis, but those little things really can make a huge difference in preparing for this. So thank you for outlining these fundamental principles and these elements to help manage a crisis. Here in the Southeast, in the recent few years, we've had drought, we've had hurricanes, we've had too much water and flooding, we've had employee deaths. Completely unfortunately, we've had a few recalls with foodborne illnesses. So it's been one of those things where we're now in that place, and as an association, we're in a position to be able to partner with our members, as well as with organizations like yours to expand the reach and expand the breadth of knowledge for those members. So thank you for putting this in such a streamlined discussion and helping us all be able to prepare.
Thank you for having me, Beth.
You are welcome. So to wrap up, I'll just remind everybody that this is a pre-recorded webinar, but you can still submit questions that we will answer. To submit a question, please type your question in the questions text box and press the send button located next to the box. At the end of the webinar, all submitted questions will come to us and we will email all answers to the individual. We will also keep a running FAQ document on the GFEGA Crisis Management webpage of all submitted questions and answers. In closing, thank you again to Amy Philpott of Watson Green for sharing your time and expertise with us during this webinar. Additionally, I'd like to thank every one of you who have joined in. You will be receiving a post-webinar survey to provide feedback on this webinar, as well as help guide future topics. Additionally, please feel free to contact the Georgia Fruit and Vegetable Growers Association or Amy with future questions. We encourage you to explore the handouts box on the side of your screen for useful tools related to today's topic. Thank you for your participation in this webinar. This concludes today's program.